before we get started with grief and you, we might do a bit of an introduction for those who have never met us. Sylvia, I'm so excited that you're here with me today and that we're doing this together. Maybe you can start with a little introduction first and then I go.
Thank
Thank
you,
you for being
Mary.
here.
Thank you for organizing this. I'm super excited too. So, for a little bit of a background story, I did not choose to work in grief like most of us. It's really something that life leads us to. And grief has been a really important part of my life. I lost my dad very suddenly when I was 7. And 10 years later, my younger brother died very suddenly in an accident. He was 16, I was 17. And for many years, I carried unattended grief because this was 30 years ago and there was no
Yeah.
support really. And then fast forward to 2019, just before lockdown, and my older brother also died suddenly in a car crash. And this was just absolutely destructive. It felt like impossible that this could happen to the same family again. And it hit me really badly.
Mm.
And I got also really angry because it made me realize that I had lost all these years to unattended grief. And I had lost precious moments where I could have been more present with my brother instead of completely at the mercy of grief. And then a few years back, 3 years ago, my mom also died peacefully, not suddenly this time. We had time to say goodbye. So we were a family of 6. Two parents, 4 kids, and over the course of our lives, it's just the two of us now, my younger brother and I. And so I've
Mm.
decided to dedicate my work to helping others go through grief and particularly understand what is happening to the brain and the body, because for
Mm.
me, it has made such a difference to dive into the science and understand that there was nothing wrong with me. My reactions and my emotions were explicable.
Mm.
So that's for my story. Mary, please share yours.
I love this so much because I feel this synchronicity between you and I, and this is why we're here today, you know. And my background is I lost my dad when I was 20, and I was not equipped to deal with grief at all. I had no idea how to handle it. It was quite dark for me for quite some time. I felt very excluded. Like I felt that my friends and family as well didn't even know how to deal with it. And despite being the youngest of 5, I was the one that everybody came to in my family to support them. So I felt early on that I definitely had more strength and resilience to deal with what we were given, even though I didn't feel like it at all. But working through that and realizing, and then also going into self development and working on my own grief and trauma. And as you and I know, like grief has got such a skill to highlight all the wounds that we haven't dealt with from our childhood, and it all comes back up. And so there was a lot of stuff for me to work through. And then 30 years later, I lost my husband to a brain aneurysm. So it was very sudden, completely unexpected. In the prime of his life, he was 45, and our boys were 10 and 8. So Rob and I had this what if conversation about 3 years prior to his passing, thinking it was all theory. We talk about what would you do, you know, if I died, what would. So grief, death, dying was not an estranged topic or a topic that we avoided in our family because I had lived it when I was 20. So that when I look back, you know, the hindsight, when you see why things happen, how things happen, it gave me this option to live a very, very present life with Rob and talk about these things. Needless to say, neither of us thought that it would ever happen, especially not so unexpectedly. And in our what if conversation, I made the promise, we made this promise to each other that if something was to happen, we would create the happiest life possible for the remaining parent and our boys. And that became my lighthouse in my darkest hour. And I wrote a book about how, you know, our beautiful story, how we met, how we connected at the barefoot wedding at the beach, et cetera, till Rob's passing and how I dealt with it. That book then ranked in a top 100 bestseller list of Amazon Australia. And that gave me the, okay, I think I've got something the world needs. And that is hope and healing where you need it the most, but expect it the least. People don't often talk about healing when it comes to grief. They talk about the heaviness and everything negative. But I think we really need to open that conversation to everything that happens around grief outside of us, but in particular within us. And I love that my background is mindset coaching. So I was already in that space for about 7 years before Rob died. your background, you really delved into the science. And I thought the two of us together, it would be such a beautiful way to bring this topic to LinkedIn, a platform that I had never thought about really talking about grief. And both you and I have been rather active on LinkedIn for quite some time now. And we connected through my podcast, Unsilence Grief. And when I had you on there, I'm like, I have to have you back. And then we sort of, birthed the idea of bringing it to LinkedIn because I feel it is a topic that is more and more talked about on LinkedIn now, which makes me really happy to see. It is a really good feeling that people talk about something that is so important. So I will hand this back to you now, Sylvia, and maybe you can give us a little bit of a background because we chose capacity as our first topic here on LinkedIn to talk about. And I'd love for you to give us a bit of a background from the scientific perspective about capacity in grief and how it is affected by grief.
Thank you, Mary. I would like to highlight two things you said that I find really interesting and important. First, the one that you had the conversation with Rob, and I think
Mm,
this is very, very important. The likelihood of being alive is one in, I can't remember how many trillions, but the likelihood
yeah.
of dying is 100%. So, we
Yeah.
just know that's going to be the next stage. It's going to transition. So I think it's really important to have these conversations with the people we
Mm.
love without fearing that they might be like a curse, or it's important to talk about it.
That's
And
exactly
it,
it. The
and
curse, right? So many people think
yes,
like once you talk about, then you jinx it, and it's like
no, no,
that's
because
yeah.
if you have talked about it, it makes such a difference
Mm,
afterwards for those who remain. It really does make a difference. And the
yeah.
other thing you said is about healing, and it's a word that I do like. And I think grief is like a wound, and a wound. When we talk about healing, it doesn't mean that it disappears. When
Mm,
you hurt yourself, when you're injured, it doesn't disappear. It heals, and it leaves a scar. It leaves a limp.
mm,
It leaves a
mm.
tender, a sore space on,
Some
on
sort
your
of
on your skin.
reminder. Yeah.
And that's, yes, and that's what it is with grief as well. So the healing process is not an erasing process, but coming back to capacity, what is our
Mm,
topic today?
I
It's
love that.
something that I had not realized how much grief impacts capacity. And I see it now as well with the people I work with, how,
Mm,
we easily label this as laziness. Oh, I can't be asked. I have just zero motivation. I'm
mm,
lazy. I can't do this. I have no energy. Well, this is all the mechanism of grief underlying. Grief is extremely taxing on the body. It is very, very stressful, and it is registered by the system as a threat. The people we love are part of our co-regulating system, so they help us soothe our nervous system, and we help them. That's just how it is in our daily life. So when they disappear, all of this is shattered, and it takes a lot for the brain and for the system to scan this new reality and try to adjust. And it's quite brutal, and it requires so much energy underneath that we are not necessarily aware of. So I would invite the listeners to really pay attention to the words they use about
mm,
themselves, and to see if they can maybe change that, the I'm lazy into I have no energy today. Could that
mm.
be a manifestation of grief? Because
Yeah.
grief shows up in ways that doesn't always look like grief. What is your experience in that, Mary, having to, your
Mm.
two children and to just keep going?
Yeah. I love what you share because what you just said is something that I work with a lot as well. The language, what language do we use when we talk about grief, but also in particular, the language that we use with ourselves, the self-talk, what we say about ourselves in our mind really determines how we receive the reality around us. And it also has an impact on our capacity. When we constantly use negative self-talk, talking down on us, I'm so lazy, I can't do this, I've got, and there's so much brain fog that comes with grief as well. It really, as you said, it really plays with the capacity. Our capacity, I actually think it doesn't even shrink. It actually grows, but it feels like it's shrinking because there's so much more that is in our brains, a billion thoughts an hour. And when we worry, like I worried so much about my children, how they would deal with it and if they're going to be okay. My focus was constantly on my kids and also the fears that came with that. So a lot of people don't even talk about that. And I'm more than happy to share this. My biggest fear after Rob died, that was that one of my sons would die. I had so much to work through. And I saw a positive psychologist for some time, for a few months after Rob died. And she was so helpful in the way I addressed it. And also because of the promise that I had made to Rob to create the happiest life possible, I was constantly focused on happiness. How can I create happiness for the boys? What can I do to make them happy? And people didn't expect that. People were waiting for us to fall apart and be sad and cry all the time. So there was this, what are they doing? Or she must still be in shock. Or there was this sense of she's not doing it right. And I had no capacity for that because all my focus was on the three of us and everything that came thereafter. Within a split second, I became a sole parent, a sole income earner, a sole everything, and I closed my business down. So there were a lot of things. And I feel, looking back now, you think you've got no capacity, but I really feel like it stretches your capacity beyond measure because all of a sudden you're dealing with so much more. And I think that the way we talk about grief really comes back to, do we honor that capacity? Or do we go into, I'm not good enough, or I don't have enough capacity, AKA I'm lazy, or I'm not showing up as I used to? Well, of course you're not. You just experienced a profound loss. How can you even expect to show up like you did before or to even be the same person? But here's my favorite perspective that I use on that. People always go like, oh, life's not ever going to be the same. But it often, very often comes from a negative perspective, as in everything's just destroyed and heavy and bad and sad now. And I'm thinking, of course, life won't ever be the same. How can it after what you have experienced? But what you make with it, what you choose as a focus, what you choose as a language, how you talk to yourself, that will make a massive difference to how life will look like for you, how you will go through life experiencing it, how you will or won't allow healing in. And what you said, I'm just going to highlight that and I'm going to hand it back to you then, Sylvia. I love it because it brought up a quote that a very, very close friend of mine has used very often. And he lost his beautiful wife to cancer. And he often said that she is the most beautiful scar on his heart. And I thought that's such a beautiful way of putting it,
That is beautiful.
because I often think of kintsugi, which I love, as in, the Japanese art to mending things with gold. And when you think of that in the space of grief, I think it's such a beautiful analogy. And my favorite go to is, rather than saying there'll always be a hole in my heart, which a lot of people use, I always say there'll always be a space in my heart for Rob. And that makes such a difference for me when I look at it from that perspective.
Yeah, you have such a beautiful way to shift perspectives. I love that idea of a
Thank
space
you.
in the heart. And I remember the first time we talked, how you said that at some point grief was a guest who had overstayed her welcome. And
Mm.
you asked her kindly to move out so that joy could
Yeah,
move back in again. And you
yeah.
were aware that grief would still come to visit every now and then, but wouldn't be
Mm,
here constantly. And I
yeah,
really like that there's a lot about perspective. And that brings us back to the words we use about ourselves. And when we label ourselves as being lazy or as being demotivated or having no energy or being useless, it's really important to notice these, because if I think I'm lazy, I'm going to push myself to be, I'm going to look for productivity hacks. I'm going to put even more
yeah.
strain on myself, and this will backfire. So the one question I like to apply is, can you ask yourself, what would do me good right now? And you might be surprised, because at first there might be a blank. And this
Yeah.
this is an important sign, because if there's a blank, it means that maybe it's time now to start to learn going from the neck down and start to feel what is going on, instead of intellectualizing and thinking this should be good for me, this is how I should feel, this is what I should be doing. But if you're being completely honest, what would do me good right now? And sometimes it's not what it's expected. Sometimes it's a glass of
Mm.
wine. Sometimes it's just lying in bed and having a nap. It
Yeah.
doesn't have to be rationally or societally correct and acceptable. You just have to listen to yourself, which is easier said than done. Mm,
I
but
love
back
this
to
so much.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, what would do me good right now? And it's a practice. It's a practice whenever we feel a bit off, and we can really trust our body's wisdom. Is so often we are completely lost, and we don't quite know what to make of the sensations. They're not even proper they're sensations. And to tune into the body and just ask, does that feel good right now? No, that doesn't feel very good. So how can I maybe shift that? Why is that? What can I do to help? Yeah. And what I also just wanted to say, that I really liked what you said about capacity, that it expands. I
Mm,
love that perspective, because I think you're right. The capacity for our daily activities shrinks, but it's because it's
mm.
expanding elsewhere for that new reality that we have to make sense of.
Yeah. And there's so much more that comes in, like the brain really has to deal with so much more than we were used to day by day. There's all of a sudden there's this like, organizing Rob's celebration of life, making sure that all the invites go out, the Facebook posts, letting people know we had to fly across the country to identify his body. That there's all these things that it's not a day-to-day activity. There is a lot
Yes.
of mental and emotional capacity required. So while we feel there's, like I can't do this, brain fog, can't remember this, can't remember that. I don't know how you like. I'd like to ask you this, Sylvia. But I don't think we ever talked about this. When I look back now, it's been 8 years since we had Rob's celebration of life, and till today, so often there's a whole heap of people that I cannot remember that were there. And I have conversations with people, and they say something about Rob or the celebration of life, and it comes up in some memory or whatever. And then I literally have to ask them that, I'm so sorry, but were you there when like, and then they say either yes or no. And I ask that over and over again. And I feel like sometimes I really feel like, oh my God, Marie, what's wrong with you? And I have to admit, I think that. And then I'm like, there's nothing wrong with me. It's called the widow brain. And there's a reason for that. Like when we deal with grief, our focus becomes just laser sharp on survival and what is needed to do to survive. And remembering 500 guests that were at the celebration of life was not part of survival. It would have been nice to know. It would have been nice to remember. And out of the 500 people that were there, I probably remember about 50. And half of them I only know because they're family that I know that they
Mm.
were there. So
Yeah.
sometimes I really feel I
Yeah.
wish there was more that I remembered. And then I have to flip it again for me and go back into gratitude for the things I do remember, the memories that I have. And the memories that I have with Rob are so much more important than remembering who was there at his celebration of life. It's a nice
Yes.
to have memory,
Yes.
but not I really, really prefer to have the memories of our barefoot wedding at the beach, whatever, like those
Yes.
things that really light me
Yeah.
up. Yeah.
It's good that you give yourself some grace for that, because as you say, there are all these things, administrative things that need to be done that require a lot of headspace. And then there's really something that Mary Frances O'Connor has shared with the world through her studies and her research. It's how much the brain needs to adapt and recalibrate. We have a map in our brain of our loved ones. They belong to our present, they belong to a future that we imagine together. And when suddenly they're gone, it is a tremendous amount of work for the brain to recalibrate and to
Yeah.
adapt to that reality. And we do not realize the amount of energy it requires. Our brains are roughly 2% of our, but 2 to 5% of our body weight, but they
Mm.
consume up to 20% of our energy. And that's in normal
Yeah.
day-to-day life. So imagine when something that major happens, it is really hard work for the brain. And there's a really interesting book by Lisa Schulman that is called Before and After Loss. And she's a
Mhm.
neuroscientist. Her husband was a neuroscientist, and he was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And in the book,
Mm.
she talks about the before and the after. It's a beautifully written
Mm.
book with the human side of it and also the science, because they're both very aware of what's going on. And she explains that the death of a loved one creates changes in the brain that are similar to a physical injury. That is how
Mm.
much it affects us. And we do not know these things, but I find that realizing that what is going on underneath just
Yeah.
gives us, a bit more understanding for our
Mm.
exhaustion and our difficulty to remember things at certain times.
Yeah. I love that you brought up the physical injury because I have used this often as an analogy. I think that's where our society has got a lot to learn from in terms of how we handle when we see somebody in grief. And I often said, it's quite a harsh comparison, but if you think of a battlefield and somebody walks onto the battlefield and there's an entire, I don't know, hundreds of wounded soldiers laying around, and they all have different grades of injuries, and if you walk in as a nurse, as a doctor, as a volunteer to help them, the first thing that you would do is to see how intense the injury is and how you can dress the wound and how you can clean the wound, how you can get them help if they have to have surgery, etc. So you go through and you want to help them heal as soon as possible. When it comes to grief, people mostly do the polar opposite. And I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but for me, this is how I see it. When you think of uh, a person in grief, there's internet, oh, this must be so hard, and they come in with comparison stories, which is worse and which is harder. And like, you wouldn't do that with a physical injury. If somebody has, like, I don't know, a really deep wound on their arm, you wouldn't go and say, oh, I know but somebody who had his entire arm amputated. Like, you wouldn't come in with a comparison. But in grief, and in birth stories as well, by the way, you always come in with the worst stories that you know. Oh, and my sister lost her husband too, so I know how you feel. No, you don't. You don't know how I feel because my pain threshold is very, very different to yours. My whole background is different to yours. My upbringing is different to yours. My spiritual beliefs is different to yours. The way that Rob and I lived our relationship is different to yours. So there are so many different factors that all contribute to the way that we experience grief. Yet with grief, we come in with heaviness. With it will all, grief will last forever, and grief will leave a hole in your heart. And there's such debilitating language around grief. But when it comes to physical wounds, we rush to help them to heal it. So I don't understand why there are such two different perspectives and ways that we are there for people going through this pain. That really puzzles
Yes.
me.
Yes, the analogy with a physical wound is good because, if someone breaks their arm, we would never expect them to accelerate the healing process.
Mhm.
We know that it takes a certain amount of time, and we accept that this amount of time is what
Yeah.
it is. And it's the same for grief. I guess sometimes what leaves people perplexed is that there's nothing to be fixed in that moment. You can't bring the person back.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
there's that people feel a bit lost. They want to help, but they don't quite know how to do it. And
Mm.
it's difficult to be around something as heavy as the death of a loved one because
Yeah.
we can't rewind time. We can't fix it by bringing the person back. Mm.
Yeah. Absolutely. So I know we've got about 5 minutes left for our first life here together. So I'm so grateful that we have this time together. Two things. Can you see if there are any questions in the chat box? If you have any questions, please feel free to write them in the chat box underneath the event, or just send us a private message. We're more than happy to come back, answer the questions, and be there for you. And before we go, I thought I'm going to put you on a spot because we didn't chat about this prior, but I think it might be a good idea because I love the way you work with people, and those listening in thinking, where and how can I actually get the best support? I would love to share maybe just a minute or two about what you do, what I do in our sessions with people when we work through grief. Can you share a bit? Because I was really, really touched. I love the way you approach it. It's slightly different to mine. So maybe we can share a bit about that before we go.
Thank you, Mari. Well, I like to approach the capacity, phenomenon and just help people rebuild some energy. And I usually start with the body. So I do a lot of somatic work, and I like giving practical tools to just physically rebuild some capacity. And then when the body feels a bit better, we start to really target the emotions. So it's a very gentle, gradual, and quite pragmatic process.
Mm.
And I also put a lot of emphasis on emotional literacy. So it's really, the body, understanding the neuroscience, and then dealing with the heavy emotions and finding ways to integrate grief into our daily life to honor our loved ones, but also our life that is happening here and now.
Mm. I love this so much, and it feels like such a beautiful and gentle approach. And one thing that I find incredibly important in grief that both you and I do so beautifully is the holding space, the holding space for people to allow whatever needs to happen in that space, whatever needs to be shared in that space, or even be comfortable with the uncomfortable and just sit in it with a friend, with a loved one who's going through grief. People often feel the need to fill the silence or share something to make them feel better. um, there is really not much to do in the space of making them feel better other than being there, being present. And I think that will make them feel better, if they don't have to be or do or say anything in that space, because that often comes with so much expectation. So I love it when I work with my clients. I very much come from the perspective of focusing on the language, what we said today, like how do you talk to yourself? How do you set boundaries for others who want to come in and fix and help, a space where you just need somebody to be there for you? How can you support people and support them through grief? So I often also focus on the people wanting to help them, but coming with different perspectives, with different language, with reframing, one of my most favorite things to do, and give them little tools to, moms, for example. There's often this, I've got to show up for my kids, I've got no choice sort of mindset. And I'm like, let's try with I get to show up for my kids rather than I got to. And that one little letter reframe, that's my
Mm.
favorite reframe out of all of them. You move from burden to opportunity. It's such a gift. It is such a gift that I get to look after my kids. I get to be there for them. And that to me, it could have been me. It could have been Rob being left behind to raise our boys, but it was me. And I feel it is such a gift that I still get to raise my boys. And in that sort of little reframe, there's also a lot of choice. I make the choice to show up, I make the choice to look after myself, to heal. And often people come from this space of helplessness. I didn't choose this. But what can you choose is always how we respond to it, who we allow into our lives, who we trust with our healing process. And there's a lot that we can actually contribute to making this journey a little bit lighter than it needs to be. Sorry, lighter than, like, it doesn't need to be as heavy. That's what I wanted to say. It came across very wrong. It doesn't need to be as heavy. So we can put more lightness in just by the perspective that we look at it, or the choices that we make and the people that we surround ourselves with. And it is absolutely okay to set boundaries if people want to come in that don't feel right. So when you spend time with people, you either walk away heavier or lighter. Just pay attention to that. So we are at the end of our half an hour. I am so, so grateful that we did this together, Sylvia, that you shared your beautiful wisdom here and gave me space to share mine. And maybe if there is just one thing that you would like to give to people to take away from this, Sylvia, in regards to capacity, maybe wrap us up here. What could that be?
Yes, I would recommend anyone really to look after the body, to not
Mm.
underestimate how much you can support the emotional load by looking after your physiology.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate spending time with you in this space. And
Thank you, Marie. Thank you.
yeah, thank you.